When you first open up Illustrator, you'll be presented with this start screen that has a bunch of different documents that you've opened recently. There's also this Create New button, which is what we're going to click because we want to create a completely new document. When you click that, you'll get this document dialog box that'll have a bunch of different settings for how you can configure your document. In this area, you have a bunch of settings that you've used recently, and then along this top bar, you have some common usages and presets for those different usages. So there's one for mobile, web, print, film and video, and art and illustration. The most common ones you'll probably be using are print and web. Web sets up your document for screen viewing, whereas print sets it up for professional print jobs. And you'll notice that when web is selected, pixels is chosen as the default unit of measurement, and it also selects RGB color and 72 ppi as the resolution. Whereas when you select print, it selects points as the default unit of measurement, with Cmyk color as the color mode and 300 ppi as the resolution. So these are just common settings for how you might want your document set up if you're taking your document to a professional print job. So for now, let's choose a print document. You can always change your unit of measurement if you want. A lot of times I like to work in inches because it's a little bit more intuitive. Everyone knows what an inch is. Whereas pikas and points, which are more traditional layout measurements, can sometimes be a little bit more confusing. But if you've ever worked with fonts, say in Microsoft Word, you're used to points because 12 points is a common size as a default for text in Microsoft Word. And so there's actually 6 pikas for every inch, and then 12 points for every pika. So pikas and points actually correspond to inches. That being said, you still might want to choose inches as your setting. If you do choose something like points or pikas, you can always use these dialog boxes to help Illustrator do some measurement conversions for you. So for instance, if you want to create a document that is 5 inches wide, but you don't know what to put for pikas for 5 inches, what you can do is just type 5 and then type in IN, which will tell Illustrator that we want inches. And then when you hit the tab key, it'll automatically translate that to pikas for you. So since there's 6 pikas in every inch, it went ahead and put 30 pikas for that measurement. So if we wanted the height to be 7 inches, for instance, we could do 7 IN, hit tab, which is going to select the next box, and it'll do that translation again. So now we have a 5 by 7 inch card. But let's go ahead and choose inches because that can sometimes be a little bit more intuitive. Here you have the orientation. So if you want to go to landscape mode, you'll see it'll flip the document between the width and the height. And then artboards, by default, you'll have 1. We'll talk more about what artboards are, but you can always create artboards in your document. So a lot of times it's best to just keep that at 1. Don't worry about bleeds for now. That's something we'll talk about more when we get into production, but it's something that's necessary when you're taking your work to a professional printer. But for now, you can just leave that at 0. And then for Cmyk Color and Ppi, we did talk about this a little bit, but basically for print, you're going to often want Cmyk, whereas for screen, you're going to usually want RGB. And then for the resolution, 300 is usually appropriate for print, whereas screen 72 is more of the default. So we'll keep it at Cmyk and 300. So once you click Create, you'll be presented with the Illustrator main interface. And it looks quite complex at first, but the nice thing about the interface in this program, and actually all the Adobe programs, is that it's highly customizable, so you'll be able to set it up how you want it. Over here on the left, you have the toolbar, which contains a bunch of different icons for all the different tools in Illustrator. And any of the tools that have a little arrow next to them in the bottom right corner have more tools hidden underneath. So if you click and hold, a little menu comes out and you can select additional tools that are hidden under the first tool. There's also this little arrow here, and clicking on that toggles between a 2-column and a 1-column toolbar. So you can choose which one you prefer. Along the top, right underneath the program menu, you have what's called the control strip. And this strip will show you settings and information that are relevant to the tool that you're using. So if you're working with typography, it'll show you options that are related to typography, whereas if you're working with shapes, it'll show you things like color and stroke options. So this is a really useful part of the program, and it's one of the things that helps simplify and make the interface for Illustrator more usable. If for some reason you don't have this control strip, you can add it by going up to Window in the Program menu and toggling on and off control with this setting right here. I highly recommend that you keep it on because it's actually one of the most useful parts of the interface, but if you don't want it for some reason, you can always toggle it off. And then over here on the right, you have a system of panels. By default, the panels are properties, layers, and libraries, but this is a highly configurable part of the interface. If you go back to the Window menu, you can see that all these different options in this section are actually panels that can be added to the interface. So for instance, if you want the links panel, you can select links, and you'll see a new window pops up with the links and also actions. The reason that actions came up is that links and actions are often kind of bundled together. But I can go ahead and click and drag along this top section to move this wherever I want. I can also click and add it as a separate column next to the panels that were already there, or I can click and drag it and combine it with this column of panels. So now that instead of just being the 3 original tabs, there's a new one for actions and links. Illustrator also gives you a bunch of default options. So if you go back to Window and go to Workspace, there are some presets that give you different panels by default for different tasks. So Essentials is the one that comes up by default. And for all these different defaults, you can always go to reset that workspace back to how it was originally. So if I reset the Essentials, it'll change it back to that default, which is just the properties, layers, and libraries panels. One of my favorite defaults to work with is the workspace called Typography, because this one will give you a lot of the panels that I think are useful. So if you go ahead and select that, you'll see you'll get a bunch of additional items over on the right, and any of these can be clicked to toggle as panels that can be opened. So you get things like the character panel, the paragraph panel, along with appearance and transparency panels. These are all things that I consider to be quite useful. And then along the bottom, you have some text here that tells you what tool you currently have selected. So I have the Eyedropper tool selected, which is why it says Eyedropper. Next to that, you have a drop-down menu, which allows you to select different artboards in your document. So since this document only has one artboard, it's artboard number 1, it only gives me the option to choose number 1. Next to that, there's another drop-down that allows you to select your level of zoom. So by default, fit on screen is the level of zoom, which zooms you into as far in as you can zoom, where the entire artboard is shown on one screen. But if I chose 100%, for instance, you can see it's going to zoom out a little bit and show this in the 5x7 inch format that we selected. So there are a few other ways that you can zoom in and out of your document, including the Command+ and the Command- shortkeys. So if I click Command+, it'll zoom in, and if I click Command-, it'll zoom out. If you're on a Windows machine, you'll have to use Control-click and Control-. So Control is the corresponding hotkey that's similar to Command. So anytime I give a hotkey with Command in it, if you're using a Windows machine, you'll have to translate that and use Control instead. You can also use the Option key, which is the Alt key on Windows. And if you have a mouse that includes a scroll wheel, you can hold down Option and scroll up to zoom in and scroll down to zoom out. And the nice thing about this feature is it'll zoom in to where your mouse is. So for instance, if I want to zoom in on this corner, I can hold down Option, hover over that corner, and zoom in, and it'll target me right in that area. So that's a really precise way to move in and out of your document. You can also use the zoom tool over here. And by default, when you're using the zoom tool, it'll zoom in. And then if you hold down Option, it'll zoom out. So again, this will zoom in to where your cursor is. So it'll center your zoom on that point. So that's another good way to work. Another thing I want to show you is the hand tool, which is the main way that you can navigate around your document. The hand tool can be accessed on the toolbar. It's a little hand. When you have it selected, you can click and drag and just sort of drag around your document, which is a really natural way to just move around. A really nice thing about the hand tool is it can be accessed at any time by clicking the space key. So for instance, if I have the rectangle tool selected, normally it would create a rectangle, but if I instead hold down the space key, the hand tool comes up instead. So anytime I have the space bar held down, I can just use the hand tool to kind of move me around. So it's something that you're going to be doing a lot in Illustrator. It also works in most of the other programs as well. So just get used to having your hand on space so you can always just move around your document in a really natural way. The space hotkey almost always works. One exception is if you're typing in a text box, the space hotkey won't work because that'll just put a space in the text that you're typing. So in that situation, you'd have to exit out of that text box in order to use the space key. So those are the basics of getting around in Illustrator. In the next video, we'll look at the toolbar and start using some of the basic tools.